Bonjour à tous. Je vous remercie pour m'inviter ici, mais moi aussi je vais parler en anglais parce que mon français n'est pas bon du tout. My name is Elisabetta Ranieri. I'm the editor-in-chief for Nature Communications, and I would like to talk to you about the contributions that publishers can provide to trust and openness in science. So first of all, the most obvious contribution that publishers have made is to implement the open access business model, which allows research results to be available immediately upon publication and can be read by anybody. And over the past 20 years, there's been great progress made in terms of the number of publishers and journals that offer some kind of open access option. My journal, Nature Communication, is one such journal. We launched in 2010. We have the largest editorial team of professional editors, and quickly to answer a point that was made earlier, I see the fact that we have independent professional editors as a positive fact as opposed to a negative thing. We apply the same rigorous and ethical peer review and ethical standards as the rest of the Nature family. And just a few words about me, as a background in applied physics. I joined the journal again in 2019. I've spent the past 7 years in research publishing, but as I said before, I was a physicist. So obviously, as we've discussed already, open science is not just about open access, that's much more than that, and therefore the contributions that publishers can make can go much beyond this. But let's take a step back and just, let's rethink about what is the role of journals and their publishers in the scientific endeavor, and this is the way I see it, of course, coming from my background as a nature person. Our journals select, validate, and publish research output. They make it available to both the scientific community and the general public, improving the accessibility of content in the latter case. We champion quality and best practice in research reporting, and we champion the research community itself. And we try to innovate wherever we can to keep up with changing times. So how can we help in the context of trust and openness? Obviously, science and the scientific community need to be robust, trustworthy, and accountable to society in order to be successful. So how can we help building trust? First of all, we can carry out rigorous validation process via unbiased peer review. And again, to address an earlier point that was made, when I say rigorous, we do read all of the papers. We recruit 2, if not 3 reviewers, mostly 3, to carry out the assessment. So we do put all of our efforts into making sure that high quality standards are upheld. We can develop and enforce ethical and community standards. We can promote research integrity, and make research results more accessible. In terms of reproducibility, we all know why this is important to scholarly communication and scholarly efforts in general. What we can do on our end as publishers is to raise awareness of this problem and enforcing editorial policy and processes that support reproducibility, offer publication venues and article formats that will, again, make sure that reproducibility is at the center front of scientific activity. We can provide credit and incentives to researchers, and finally promoting the reuse of research. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of activities or initiatives that we've carried out within Nature Research, which is sort of the family of journals that publishes Nature Communication. And I will start with reproducibility. So in the physical sciences, for example, we have worked in conjunction with 2 very specific research communities, namely researchers that work with solar cells and laser devices. And working with them, we've come up with this reproducibility checklist, which identifies best practice and standard requirements to accurately report scientific results in these areas. So this checklist is authors have to fill this checklist when they submit a paper to make sure that all this essential information about the characterization techniques and the properties of these devices is then included in the paper. And in the life sciences, again, similar reporting summary. This is an 18-point checklist about key methodological and analytical parameters that authors are asked to include in this document, which is then shared with reviewers, and this is again done with the purpose of raising the standards on reporting of statistics and the scrutiny during peer review process. We have also lifted length restrictions for the method section because you need as much time as you do, as much space as you do to make sure that you provide all the information that can enable reproducibility. And this is working. There was a paper published earlier this year by the NPQIP collaborative group in BMJ Open Science, which studied the impact of this change in editorial policy on the reporting of life science research. That's the DOI, you can go and look it up if you like. And they found that there was a measurable and quite significant improvement in the reporting of this type of research following this change in editorial policy. The criteria that they were looking at, called this the Landis 4 criteria, this parameter increased from 0% to 16.4% after the introduction of the policy, which is not 100% yet, but it's a step in the right direction. So in the context of openness, how can we help as journals and publishers? Obviously, openness and transparency breed trust via accountability, so how can we help? Again, we can support and enforce data sharing practices and data sharing standards, particularly for images in the life sciences, that there's a lot of problems that are there linked to reproducibility. We can make the review process more transparent and open, for example, by recognizing our reviewers. We can carry out study on peer review ourselves or make the data available for independent studies. And we can help disseminate the negative results and replication as opposed to just the positive fancy results, and ultimately making research results more reusable. So again, a few examples of activities that I'm familiar with that we've carried out. In 2017, Peer Review Week was all about transparency. We've published an editorial in Nature that was detailing what kind of steps we are taking as a publishing group to increase openness and transparency. And so as an example, so Nature Communications, but also Nature and some of the other sister journals have started publishing reviewer names where the reviewer agrees to this. So as you can see at the bottom, there is a reviewer information statement that ends up published with the paper that thanks anonymous reviewers and whoever of the reviewers wanted their name published for their contribution to the process. And we see, as I said, this is a reviewer opt-in, so we have about 55% of reviewer uptake at Nature at the moment. And as I said, Nature Communications has also started doing this very recently, about 6 months ago. Also, still Nature Communications, we have started publishing anonymous reviewer reports in 2016. Again, this is not a reviewer choice, it's an author choice. So we have about 60% author uptake overall, but as you can see from the graph, the response to openness varies by discipline, with ecology and evolution areas going much higher than the 60%, and atomic physics scoring quite lower. At the moment, the reviewer reports and the author rebuttals are published as a PDF file in the supplementary information. We know this is not ideal. We would like ultimately to have them to have a DOI assigned to the reports so that the reports themselves can be citable as well. And let's talk about ORCID and author contributions in general. I hope everybody here is aware of what ORCID is and familiar with it, and possibly has an ORCID account. ORCID is a unique identifier for researchers that is now required by many publishers, and it was introduced to disambiguate authorship and make authorship contributions more transparent. So in 2017, 14 Nature journals started a trial in which we were mandating ORCIDs for corresponding authors of accepted papers. And this trial was really successful. As you can see from the graph, there was an increased compliance in the numbers of ORCID accounts that were added to the system, which extended even beyond the titles in the mandate. So as a result, later last year, we rolled out this mandate to all of the Nature reviews and research journals, and we are now thinking of how can we implement ORCID for reviewers as well. Talking about preprints, obviously preprints are essential because they allow the early dissemination of results before a paper is actually published. We've always, in the past several years, supported the posting of primary research manuscripts on recognized preprint servers, and now going one step further, Nature Communications now offers the option to authors whose papers is being sent to external review to include the paper on a public list of articles under review, and in this list they have to provide a link to the preprint of their manuscript, and this is again to accelerate the dissemination of results. So this is how the website look like, and I have to say the author uptake for this initiative is currently not as high as we would like. It's about 4% of authors of whose papers are sent to review that opt in. However, of those, 58% ends up depositing a preprint on a server after, as a result of this initiative, and I think that's really great. Going back to authorship, we have always enforced transparency in author contribution by mandating a statement, like as the example that you can see, which details what exact contribution each author has brought to the paper. And we are now thinking of going one step further and having, something's missing on the slide, and having the credit taxonomy integrated with this more granular system. Credit, for those that don't know about it, is a taxonomy of 14 very general terms, and if we adopted this, then this could be machine readable, and it could be also more could be standardized across various disciplines. But obviously, open science, as we've discussed, is not just about opening up the research papers, it's about making the data open and fair, as we discussed earlier. We know sharing data has benefits for individual researchers in terms of increasing their recognition and their impact in their field, and increasing the validity of what they're doing, but also for the research community, because this sharing data reduces the unnecessary experiments that need to be carried out because data is already out there, enables replication, and ultimately it leads to the advancement of research and of science. So what we are doing is now mandating, like many other journals, mandating a data availability statement, which is a statement authors are required to add at the end of the paper that tells readers how they can get hold of their data. Again, there can be sensitive data which can't be made available or needs to be anonymized before it's made available. There's all sorts of nuances there, but this statement needs to be there. And besides, that being good because it allows data reuse and data share, we are doing this to try and learn more about how different disciplines share data in different ways, and therefore how we can help them to meet the challenges that they face in their specific discipline. Besides data, sharing code and materials is equally important. So it's a condition of publication in our journals that unique materials are made available to others to enable replication of the study. And in terms of sharing computer code, we now have a code availability statement, which is similar to our data availability statement, again, to foster sharing and reuse of data. It's, to make results really useful, we should not just thinking about publishing the very positive and fancy and trendy results, but we should be publishing all results. So BMC Research Notes is another journal that is published by Springer Nature, who's the publisher of the Nature research titles as well. And they publish like non-traditional but still valid research outputs that cannot be considered full articles. This can be updates to previous work or addition to established methods or experiments that just didn't work but whose results can still be useful to someone else so that they don't make the same mistakes. And in this context, we also have journals now, such as Nature Human Behavior, who publish register reports. Register reports, for those that don't know about them, are an article format that puts emphasis on the validity of the methodology of the study as opposed to the validity of the results. So the peer review already happens before the study has even started. And if the methodology is found to be valid, when the results are available, the journal commits to publish them. And then finally, in terms of openness, Springer Nature also has this thing called Shared It, by which we provide our authors and readers with shareable links to view only versions of the full version of the paper, which can be shared on social media, on author website, can be shared anywhere obviously for non-commercial personal use. And if the article is open access, the link also allows to download, print and save the PDF. If not, it will just show it, but at least it's out there even for our subscription titles. So openness is all good and well, but it can also go wrong. So sort of on the other side of the medal, we need to think that we need to manage openness very carefully, because it can also lead to misunderstandings and therefore in mistrust. Examples of this can be the case of early career researchers. There's been surveys carried out on their attitude towards publishing their names when they are reviewing articles, and they are skeptical that this might impact negatively their career progression. So again, openness in that context is not seen as a good thing. And also you can think of, we all know about fake news, and if we think about the impact that social media can have in amplifying inaccurate results that come out of incomplete research processes, we are all aware how dangerous that can be. So my take on this is that openness is great, that's where we need to go, but it needs to be by design, it needs to be concerted, and we need the input of researchers, funders, and publishers all working together to achieve this. So in terms of what can go wrong, openness in an author list, for example, can sometimes result in implicit bias. So I'm just giving you an example of how we've addressed this, or tried to address this. We've introduced 4 years ago double-blind peer review as an optional service to authors. This is when the reviewers are not aware of the author identity. And last year, I've actually published a study on the results of uptake and outcome of these manuscripts in the submissions to all the Nature journals over 2 years. And just to give you a summary of the key results, we've seen that only 12% of authors choose this option, the double-blind option. There is no gender difference. However, there is a small but significant difference in the tier of the journal that they submit to, with Nature having a higher proportion of double-blind papers than Nature Communications, for example. We also seen that the outcome of these papers, of the double-blind papers, tend to be worse than that of single-blind submissions at the initial editorial screening and also post-review. And finally, we wanted to look at potential gender bias in the reviewer pool, but these data actually, which might hint at some bias towards against female corresponding authors, is actually not really conclusive, because the sample size was not enough to produce statistically significant results. And then very briefly, so again, in terms of the implicit bias, we are well aware of that there are gender and country imbalances among our author and reviewer pools. Nature Genetics published this editorial where they analyzed their geographical and gender breakdown of their authors and reviewers, and saw that there are discrepancies there. And Nature published this comment 2 years ago, again showing how the fraction of female and male reviewers doesn't quite match that of the author pool. So we now have a diversity task force that is tasked to come up with initiatives that will achieve a more diverse pool of authors and reviewers. And this brings me to the point of on diversity, because there's mounting scientific evidence that shows that diversity in teams is very beneficial. It leads to better science and better results. But we all know, I'm guessing, that science has a diversity problem at the moment. There's not enough representation from all gender groups and all ethnicity groups or geographical groups. So we are working hard on this. And just to give you an example, these are just a few of my 90 editors, and And just to show you, how diverse our team is, and I think this is one of our strengths. So what we can do as publishers is, again, to strive for balance in the gender and ethnical and geographical breakdown of our commissioned content authorship in our pool of reviewers, our speaker panels. We can do advocacy, news content, and we can collect demographic information for reporting purposes. So just to give you an example, what we've done a study of the gender breakdown in Nature for reviewers and authors, and we saw quite a small increase of 4% in the number of female reviewers over 6 years. It's not huge, but it's a step, again, in the right direction. And with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Question? Oh, great, many. You first. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is René van Schomberg, Open Science Policy Development, European Commission. I mean, there is, of course, now a lot of discussion on open access, but concerning the rationale of open science is, of course, very much the notion of sharing knowledge and data prior to publication. And because of the current wrong rewards and incentive systems, to some extent, of course, also post-publication. Now, the editorial board of Nature did in 2016 an interesting survey. They questioned, I think, a couple of thousand scientists on the quality of the data, and then it appeared that 70% of those scientists could not reproduce the data of another group's experiments. Now, let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that Nature is still a good journal. But these data must cause some headaches for journals, not just for Nature. So my question is, in the view that the quality of the data in the course of a further development of open science, also with a view on EOSC, becomes ever more important, and to make science really work, we will have to share data prior to publication, and then the quality of data will become enormously important. But given this survey and what else we have from sources is that there are very bad indicators about the quality of those data. So I was wondering what type of response a journal like Nature has given these circumstances.
I mean, this is a question that goes beyond what, the role of publishers, right? Because especially if you share data before publication, that needs to be something that comes from the research community for the research community. What we can do, as I mentioned briefly, is to making sure that we support this transition to opening up the data, and this can include for example, working with the community to come up with data sharing standards, because obviously each community will have different practices, and if, as we were saying earlier, if there is not enough metadata around the data describing what the data even means, it's pointless, right? So we can work with the researchers and just say, look, let's go together, how in this particular discipline, what is it that we need to define about the data to make the data reusable? Then, of course, it's up to that community to actually share the data. We can enforce this when somebody submits a paper, but we can't force them to submit to us, right? So it needs to be, we can work with you, we work with the research community, but it needs to go both ways. Does that answer your question?
Well, it seems that you shift the responsibility a little bit away from the problem, because if you know that also the data underlying your publications are in a lot of cases not so well, then you cannot shy away that there is a problem for a publishing forum. I mean, you cannot only say it's the individual scientist who submits something. Then there is a problem with the review process, or there is a problem in the scientific community in producing these data as such. But I mean, there is a co-responsibility here.
Yeah, I'm not shying away from it. I'm saying we can work with that community and enforce, for example, the submission of raw data when papers are submitted and making those raw data available to peer reviewers, this is something that we are thinking of implementing right now. Of course, not as a mandate initially, but trying to encourage this to happen. So we can facilitate in that sense, making sure that the good quality data are available to peer reviewers, they are assessed as part of the peer review process, ultimately published and made available to everybody. Of course, this can't lift the responsibility entirely from the individual researchers because they are producing the data in the first place, but we can do our best to support them.
Thank you. Thierry, introduce yourself.
Yes, Thierry Gelly from INSERM, and I will be talking this afternoon. I have two questions. The first one is to which extent, and you tackle a little bit of that, but not extensively, to which extent do all of what you have described for Nature communication apply to all Nature journals, and particularly to Nature, which I'm not sure that's the case. And secondly, I'm pretty sure you may not be able to answer that one, but I'm still going to ask. Is the model of Nature communication with the APC the way they are, does it make it a sustainable or profitable journal, or does it work only because it's together with the other journals?
Okay, to your first question, which is the one that I can answer. So some of the initiatives that I've described are peculiar to specific journals within the portfolio, and most of them that I've described are actually Nature communications only at the moment. The reason is quite simple. The reason is that Nature communication is high volume and broad scope, so we can test ideas in there, and hopefully when we have enough data to see that they work, we can migrate them to other titles. So there are talks of expanding, for example, the transparent peer review option to other Nature titles. Your second question, I can't answer because I'm not a publisher, I'm an editor, and I don't have that type of information. If the world were to transition to open access overnight, obviously this will be a problem for the more selective titles, such as Nature and all the Nature research titles, and I don't know how to solve that, but it's not my job to do so. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, Patrick Couvreur, Académie des Sciences. So my question, you explained very well the peer review process, which is fair. I have no question about that. But before the peer review process, there is sending or not sending the paper to a reviewer. And for me, this is still unclear. What is the process? What are the parameters you are taking into account? And what is the percentage of papers which are sent to the reviewers or immediately rejected?
Yeah, so the last bit is the easy one to answer. Well, all of it is easy, but so depending on the journal, but on average about 20% of what we receive is sent to reviewers, and of that 50% is going to be accepted. So the process by which we select papers to go to review is a process by which we assess the full manuscript against the state of the literature, and we try to understand what is the novel aspect and how much of that is an advance compared to the state of the literature. The assessment is done, as I was saying, by professional editors, but that doesn't mean that they're incompetent. They were scientists with PhD and in most cases several years of postdoc experience in that area, so they are qualified to make that assessment, and the fact that they read so many papers every day, this actually keeps their sort of awareness and they're up to speed, right? Because that's all they do, they read all day. So in that sense, they are qualified to make this assessment. Of course, there's always going to be a degree of subjectivity, as there is when in review reports, right? Because we're all human, we all have ideas, we all make mistakes, right? So there is a degree of something that is important to you might not be as important to me, and therefore we disagree, and that's a rejection as opposed to sending to review. But we are always open to discuss with the authors. If authors appeal the decision, we are willing to reconsider if we've made a mistake.
Okay,
thank you.
You have a question here from the president of the Academy.
Well, a very brief question. Unfortunately, sometimes there are papers which are retracted, but we don't know why. Would it be possible to give the reason, because it's very different from misuse of, science, or because there were some just mistakes, which would explain the retractation. So we would like to could you comment on that?
So when we retract the paper, we publish a retraction notice that gives some details of why that retraction came to be. And if we know that there were problems, for example, an institutional investigation, we would mention that in the retraction notice. If we were not aware of that for whatever reason and the retraction came at the request of the author, that the retraction notice might not have that information, but just because we didn't have it at the time, we went to press, right? So if if we try to be as transparent as we can on the reasons for the retraction, but it's the investigation of something that went wrong is to some extent beyond our remit. We have to rely on the information that is provided to us by the institutions, by the authors, and by the readers.
One more yes, go ahead. Identify yourself and ask the question.
Journalist, I am as well an anthropologist, and we are doing also a little bit trying to have the dialogue between open science and open society. We did, for example, at the Astronomical Observatory, the European Researcher Night. We did the 400 years of Galileo. Now the question is, thank you for your bright presentation. How many readers today Nature has? And which kind of improvement you were able to identify with all these open access affair? And what are the technical time to publish and to be published? Now also congratulations for the top 10 Nature. That is also a good reference to the civil society. So, voila, to have this kind of panorama. Thank you.
If I understand what the main question was, so I don't have the numbers of the readership of Nature because that varies per journal, and I don't have the figures. But obviously, it will be in the hundreds of thousands, and the website has millions of page views per month. So we can take some, my journal in particular, we know has 2.5 million views per month, so that can give you an idea of the readership. In terms of the impact of open science, again, I don't have data specific to us, but there have been studies carried out that have shown how open access publications get cited more and get more visible, are more visible just because obviously anyone can access them and can reuse the results as opposed to subscription-based model. And then, sorry, what was the last question? Technical time. So again, that will vary journal by journal. We have an average of 200 days from submissions to accept. So that is about 6 months on average. But of course, this will vary greatly by discipline, and individual cases might be much longer or much shorter.